and welcome back to another day in the arena. It's me, it's CGB, and today in the arena we are doing a little bit of a review of the early access play and decks and cards of Dominaria, specifically cards. I am going to do a video talking about which cards overperformed for me, which cards underperformed for me. I'm going to answer some of the most frequently asked questions I get around new set time. And when I mean frequently, I do mean frequently. I mean on every social platform, via DM, replies to tweets, in every chat of every stream I do, in every comment section of every video. People want to know things like which card was the best, which deck do you like the most, which cards basically underperformed and overperformed. So after the early access, I decided for the first time I think I've ever done something like this, I'm going to make a video where I answer all those questions. And for those of you looking for gameplay today, I promise you that gameplay is coming in two different ways. One, I did a live stream. There's a 7-hour video and I do play a good amount of games in that video. Have you watched the whole thing? That can be a good way to get some gameplay. And then the second way is that today, if you're watching this on release day, like many of you do, I will be live streaming the release of Dominaria United. I'm going to do it. We're going to do it on YouTube again. It was so great. So thank you to everybody who tuned in on Tuesday for the early access stream. We're going to broadcast the black screen day of Magic Arena. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Arena is kind of infamous for on release day. The release doesn't always go as planned. It doesn't always work. There's been a lot of release days where there's just a bug where you just get a black screen when you try to queue up or log in. So I just call it, black screen day, aka set release and rotation day. So yeah, their servers aren't always prepared for the load that us Magic players bring when we need our fix of post-rotation standard. Yes! And so yeah, I'll be live streaming that grand event once again. Let's see just how many bugs we can find here on day one as Magic Arena is released on September 1st. To everybody, you all get your hands on Dominaria United. But what should you craft? What's good? What did we learn in early access? That's what this video is going to go over. Before I dive in 100% to that, Lord Kaiju, LK2, thank you for signing up on Patreon. $9.99 tier, and you are a US resident, so you're going to get Shark and Wolf tokens sent to your door. And thank you very much for supporting me on Patreon. Also a friend and a content creator who you can check out on Twitch. So with that said, LK, you are very cool. Let's get into the cards that overperformed for me in early access. First up on my list is Plaza of Heroes, which the legendary tribal kind of deck was absolutely... It was vicious. Definitely a bit of a one-dimensional deck, but felt like it could play a number of ways. And it wasn't an auto build like these decks often are in a small standard, where you just like, okay, well, here's the 8 best cards, play 4 of each of them, and away we go, right? No, there were a lot of options. There was a lot of tweaking and tuning to be done, and there actually are different angles to take with the deck. My specific list focused on human tribal, and Plaza of Heroes. Whenever I had this land in my opening hand, I felt like the correlation to actual victory was very close because I just knew my mana was going to be extremely good. And when I had 2 of these, it felt like I could cast everything, which was amazing. And then on top of that, I actually used the final mode on it. Did you know there are 4 abilities on this card? It's kind of pushed and insane. The 3 and a tap to exile it, target legendary creature, gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Yeah, but it didn't stop there. There are so few good utility lands in this format. I considered, and I probably will in the future, playing Plaza of Heroes in my monocolored decks just because you might be able to save an indestructible creature. If your color requirements were already well handled, if you're considering running 20 plus swamps in, say, a mono black deck, then running 1 or 2 Plaza of Heroes doesn't sound crazy. You might be able to save your legendary black creature from something, anything, with the ability of this land, which could definitely come up. And we'll get to some legendary black creatures that you may want to save. So Plaza of Heroes, a must craft if you're going to play the 5-color deck. maybe the best land in, okay, I'm sure the best land in the set, because I think that 5-color deck is very legit, and we'll have plenty more to say about that as we go. The next card that overperformed my expectations is Herd Migration. This is a card I didn't have tremendous excitement for. Part of it was I didn't see all the cards with Domain, and I wasn't sure if playing all the cards with Domain would be good. If Domain were, generally speaking, a bad strategy, Herd Migration would probably not be a playable card. However, I'm happy to report that Domain is a very playable strategy, very powerful, possibly one of the most fun strategies that you could play in the new format, and definitely something that you're going to want to do in Control, and Herd Migration is a huge part of it. You generally are taking turn 2 off. You're usually not doing anything with turn 2 in that deck. A big reason is a card that we'll get to that's down the line, Temporary Lockdown. Another reason is there just aren't a lot of meaningful 2-drops, just a couple removal spells. Herd Migration fills the role perfectly. When combined with the Celestis, it gives you something to do with your mana while getting your Celestis trigger. You know that matters to me. But casting it for 4 or 5 beasts is actually a big impact on the board once you've slowed the game down or just want to stabilize the ground permanently. And it's a very, very good card for that job. So Herd Migration really outperformed. And if you're going to play a grindier version of the Domain deck, I can't imagine doing it without this card. It really brought me a lot of happiness because it meant I was never missing land drops. And if you don't miss land drops in the Domain deck, it goes very well for you. The next card that so insanely overperformed expectation, like, wow, Leyline Binding. 5 and a white, this enchantment, this flasher with Domain that exiles target non-land permanent until it leaves the battlefield. People were like, no Vanishing Verse, haha. We have Vanishing Verse right here, and it's not quite Vanishing Verse at home. This card is absolutely wild. The amount of times that this is a 1-mana play will blow your mind. But if you lead on Naya Triome into Grixis Triome, or yeah, that is it? Yeah, it has, yep. If you lead on Naya Triome, untap, play Grixis Triome, and I know that's not what they're called, Xander's Lounge, Jetmir's, whatever, you know, Garden, yeah, that's it. You know what I'm talking about. If you do that, you have this card on turn 2 for 1 mana. It's not hard on turn 3 to play Celestis and then play this for 1 mana. And as a removal spell for just 1 mana that hits any permanent, it was absolutely necessary and bonkers. And it could definitely be, let's be honest, that in early access, people just weren't ready and didn't have any ways, it felt like, to remove enchantments. I don't know, I can't recall any time I gave my opponent back something from the binding, except for when they had binding, when they were playing a very similar deck to mine. So yeah, this card is right now not very vulnerable on the battlefield and absolutely destroying all kinds of situations, an absolute blowout from all kinds of angles. This card, people ask me constantly what the best card was, and they probably will continue to, which is why this video is so good. I think that this was the best overall card. The card that just absolutely every time I drew it was like, yes, you know, just a perfect answer to every single thing my opponents tried to do to me at instant speed for 1 mana most of the time. And I mean, it's not that bad. If you play any of the 3-color lands, then this only costs 3. So it's a flashing Oblivion Ring. That's already push. That's already better than you usually get with this style of card. So if you play any of the tri-lands, this card is on. It's get used to it, because I would build decks that were Esper or blue-white, and then it's like, I'm really just supposed to play the Triumph so I can play Leyline Binding for cheaper. And you do. So get used to that right away. The next card is the card that I believe was the most powerful overall for the set, Jodah the Unifier. This card lived up to the hype in a huge way. He doesn't look it. He looks just kind of like a nerdy dude with some kind of a flowery sash Hawaiian lei on, you know? He looks like he's all talk. He looks like Chris Columbus in this frickin' photo. But, guys, Jodah is the ultimate MTG Chad. Like, just the alpha male of the game and probably will be for a while. The only thing holding Joda back, really, is how expensive the deck is. The most important, and here's the thing about the card, legendary creatures you control get +X, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. What you have to do is just play some critical mass of legends. You don't have to play all legends. You can play other cards like Hopeful Initiate. You can play other disruptive strategies. You might play these cards like Brutal Cathar. You just need like some critical mass of legends. Maybe it's 24, but maybe it's all legends. You can do it either way. Obviously, Plaza of Heroes is better the more legends you play, and that land is crucial to making Joda work. But when this card hits the battlefield, just all your creatures get so insanely pumped, the opponent's usually just dead. Like, this thing just comes in as such an insane amount of stats for 5 mana. For 5 mana, you are often adding like 20 power and toughness to the battlefield. If you have a Helana and Elena in this card, it's madness, because obviously this thing pumps the Helana Elena, and then Helana Elena give back the +1/+1 counters and haste to Joda, and you're just swinging for insane amounts of damage. So you probably already saw the video of that. If you're not a believer yet, you can watch a number of other content creators. You can watch a number of things. This card was absolutely destroying the early access event. It's a kind of power level I haven't felt since Omnath, and Omnath was very different. I'm not saying that this card is as good as Omnath. Omnath was like, you knew it was value and you knew it was OP, but it took forever. You know, it took a lot of sequencing, it took a lot of deck building, it took a lot of setup, and then it was just like generating mana, gaining life. It usually extended the game a good amount of time, but you knew you were going to win. Joda just comes down and it's over. Like, they answer or it's over. And with so many of the sweepers and a lot of the removal spells, like being like cost dependent, being size dependent, you're thinking Meat Hook Massacre. Man, meat hooking a board with Joda on it is nearly impossible. Everything is way too huge. Just way too huge. So yeah, I look forward to seeing the evolution and how the 5-color human/legendary tribal deck evolves. Because Joda is pretty much insane, and people are going to find ways to compete with and deal with it. It is a 5-mana creature, so it dies to Doomblade, and it can be countered. But when you're building your decks, one thing I encourage you to do is try to treat whenever you cast a legendary spell from your hand, the cascade part of the card, treat that a little more like flavor text. I don't think you need to have perfect cascade setups or include cards in your deck that are only good because of the cascade effect. You're like, oh man, it's so cool, we need to have this to cascade into. I don't think that's needed. I think that the juice is all in just slamming this card and attacking for 1,000,000. So find a critical mass of legendary creatures that make this card hit for like +2, +3 or more. And then the other cards in your deck can be interactive. They can be removal. They can be disruptive. They can be non-legendary, I think. Oh, that's the way I see it right now. The next card that overperformed is Cruelty of Gixx. One thing I also want to point out, I did play a lot of games, and you can watch all the games I played between the video that posted yesterday and the stream that was posted on Tuesday. You can watch every game that I played in early access. I didn't do any offline grinding, but I did watch a lot of other content creators with... I basically had another content creator on every spare moment while early access was going that I was not playing. For reference, mostly Ali Eldrazi, Ash Lizzle, and Crokies. Shout out to those cool people, and thank you for keeping me entertained. And they played a lot of these cards, and I formed a lot of opinions based on how they played these cards as well. I did not play Cruelty of Gixx. I don't know if I resolved it even once. I think I had it in my hand once, and I was taking a beat down from an aggro deck, and it looked really bad for me. But watching the way that this card played in for other creators made me a believer. Like, I am a full believer that this is kind of a busted card. You can do really sick things like play Fable of the Mirror Breaker on Chapter 2, discard a Titan of Industry, and you can play Cruelty of Gixx and just read ahead to Chapter 3 and just have Titan on turn 4 because you attacked with your little Goblin Shaman and made a token. that's probably game. That's really freaking good. If you don't have a Titan, you can Chapter 2 search up a Titan and just spam Titans of Industries and Fable the Mirror Breakers until the opponent dies. All you need is some removal and some land, and you'll be fine. But the Chapter 1 does hit hard. In the mid-range mirrors, like, you often take very, very good cards. So the Cruelty of Gixx, by the way, the other cycle I saw that just really sold me, Chapter 2. Search your library for a card. What if you just search for another Cruelty of Gixx in the matchup where it's good? And then you go get another? And then you go get, like, you just get all the Cruelties of Gixx out of your deck so that you just have something to play every turn that continues to get you further and further ahead, more and more value. It's insane. It's wild. I mean, I'm sure there will be a lot of feels bads from opponents trying to set up, and you know, you just play Cruelty and take their key card, and then the next turn get whatever you want and dismantle them. Like, it was a very powerful card. I can't wait to play it in some different mid-rangey type shells, especially Jund, as soon as Dominaria goes live. So yeah, highly recommend Cruelty of Gixx. Next card is Sphinx of Clear Skies. 3 blue, 5/5 flying, wardness, domain, factor fiction, Sphinxy. One of the funniest comments I kept seeing again and again by somebody who really thought they were really, really funny. Like, they made this comment in like every Twitch chat. There are clouds in the art. Get it? It's the Sphinx of Clear Skies, but there are clouds in the art. It's like a contradiction in the title and art. Wow. Anyway, this card I did give a 0 because I wasn't a believer. And again, my take on this card could definitely change if the meta shifts and knows how to deal with it. But much like Joda as just a 5/5 with huge stats, Sphinx as a 5/5 coming down was not getting dealt with very well. The removal spells that most opponents played were not up to the challenge, and neither were the stats of the creatures they were hoping to slam into it. The ward 2 was a pretty significant cost as well. Most of my Sphinxies of Clear Skies survived, and several did hit my opponents in the face. Shout out to Hello Good Game, who gave me the beloved 5-0 pile on the Factor Fiction. Leyline Binding is probably the best answer to it, and when people start playing this card more, Sphinx might not be as good, but at least in the early access event, my opinion of this went up a lot, and I can't imagine playing the domain deck, at least in the first week of the format, without this card, because it does get you a lot of cards. I had 3 in my final version of the deck. If you're going to craft it, I would recommend crafting 2. You probably don't need the 3rd, and it might not turn out to be a card that survives the format, but my opinion of this card is much higher than it was before early access. The next card that I think is an overperformer is the Soul of Windgrace, mostly from watching other streamers. I have not yet resolved the Soul of Windgrace and had the pleasure of getting lands from the graveyard onto the battlefield, but what I saw it doing for other streamers, it was a very good mid-rangey, grindy threat that did all kinds of interesting things that you want it to do. So I think that this card will be one of the first things that I try when the set drops, and it definitely looked like a real player. I didn't see anybody playing it who regretted it, so I think that this card is my opinion of is higher. Like, I'm pretty sure it's a safe craft for a Jund mid-range type decks. The next card that is overperformed for me is Sheldred the Apocalypse. 2 black 4/5 death touch, draw card, gain 2, opponent draws card, lose 2. For one thing, it's legendary. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but legendary is such a big deal in this particular format because you can cast it and protect it with Plaza of Heroes. So that was one of the cards I just wanted to throw Plaza into mono black to protect my Sheldreds. Once again, early access, people are figuring things out. This dodged most of the removal that my opponents had in their deck. They just couldn't seem to get rid of it because of Voltage Surge. Even when you sack a treasure, doesn't kill it. If you don't attack with it, the opponent can't Wandering Emperor it. The opponent, Leyline once again was the biggest threat to it, and if you run ways to get rid of the Leyline, you get it back. The amount of like life swings that this thing creates was pretty incredible for the most part. The death touch I don't recall particularly mattering, but just having this chilling on the battlefield really messed people up. One of my favorite things that I saw was a Rafine and like 7 creatures attacked in for the opponent with this on the battlefield, and they connived. It just died. It was so nasty. I only tried this card in mono black alongside some other 4-drops, and this was one of the better cards in that deck for sure. When the opponents don't remove it, it does really swing a game, and my opinion of the card is much higher than it was before. Next card that went up in my eyes is Temporary Lockdown. Honestly, this card is medium to me overall. But the reason it's so high is because there was a number of matchups where I'm like, oh, there's a reason that deck isn't going to exist in the format. For example, Clerics, Soldiers, any number of monocolored aggro decks. Like, you play Lockdown, they're done. Anvil, I was looking at my board against Anvil being like, if I draw a Lockdown, they're just done. Green-white enchantments, Weaver of Harmony type stuff. Lockdown, done. This card definitely lived up to the hype for me, and in control shells there aren't a ton of cheap cards you want to play, so it's easy to fill your curve thanks to cards like Herd Migration, Make Disappear, if you want to play something on turn 2 that isn't affected by Lockdown. So yeah, and being an enchantment, which matters because we'll get to that in a minute. Lockdown, very good. Next card over here is Braids Arisen Nightmare. Braids, I did not play it, but I saw other people playing it, and for the most part, the setups where I saw where the opponent could sacrifice, where you could sacrifice an artifact, the opponents did not often have one, and in those spots, Braids was very, very good. So you want to play this with treasure tokens, blood tokens, Anvil. Like, I'm not going to sit there and play a lot of Anvil. I don't enjoy playing Anvil in early access very much, but when I saw players do it, Braids was very, very good. So I think Braids is super legit for that deck. Another card that's very legit, in my opinion, is Liliana of the Veil. I think this card overperformed even in black decks that I think were very misbuilt. I think my deck was very misbuilt. Let me go on the record there. I'm not really talking about other creators. I also saw this shoehorned into a ton of decks where it felt awkward. And that makes sense because we're all trying to figure it out. I think the right Liliana deck will be a real deck. The low resource game plan where everybody's top decking is something that some people really enjoy, and Liliana definitely brought me back to, God, what year was it? Like 2009, whenever it was that we were playing Liliana Magic, of just like, all right, we both have all our resources removed from the board and our hands destroyed, and now we are top decking, and yep. I haven't played that style of Magic in a very long time because more resources has been Magic the Gathering since Arena has kind of been here, and especially since Eldraine. So this was an interesting change of pace. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I also don't think my decks were very good. I think creating the right shell for Liliana, she's going to be a killer. Next up is Zur the Enchanter. My favorite deck from early access was Zur Enchantments Go Burr. And so being able to turn your temporary lockdown, even in a matchup where it missed and didn't do much, into a creature and swing with it was really good. Zur over impressed in a number of ways, but mainly because of the scale it has into the game. You can drop it on turn 3. The opponent should probably deal with it, because if you played any enchantment like a Spirited Companion, well, it's going to get stronger the next turn, and the Spirited Companion having Death Touch was probably a lot better than I even realized when you drop a Zur. Like that curve of Death Touch Spirited Companion into Zur could just brickwall them if they don't kill Zur. However, if you play Zur in the late game, like the mid to late game, and just animate some stuff and then attack with them the same turn because they don't have summoning sickness because they were already on the battlefield, the life total swing is tremendous. And decks like Mono Red, decks like Anvil have a terrible time with that. In particular, Zur combos with one other card that I said was probably the best card I played, Leyline Binding, to create, maybe you cast this for 1 or 2 mana. Zur turns it into a 6/6. And when Xur dies, it is still a 6/6. I killed a lot of people with my Leyline. It's one of those moments where Xur comes down and animates this and you're swinging with a Hexproof Death Touch 6/6 lifelink that the opponents go, oh my god. And yeah, definitely Xur, much better than I thought it was. Shauna the Purifying Blade is another overperformer for me. I drew a lot of cards with this card. I saw other people not playing it, and I don't really understand why. I do understand that it can die early, but if it does, the opponent doesn't have their Lightning Strike to hit your Lagrella the Magpie, your Helana Elena, your many other cards. And the number of times I played this card and then pumped it with Helana and Elena and swung with it the turn it came down and drew a card or two while also gaining 5 life, like that was really nuts. I think this card is a real player. I think it's definitely worth like 2 of at minimum in the humans deck, in my opinion. Okay, a card I was not very high on, and then I am now very, very high on. I was like medium on this. I could see some potential, but now I'm like, whoa. Archangel of Wrath got me out of situations that I did not think I could ever get out of. There were times where it was literally the best draw in my deck. There were times I was so far behind on board, I would have scooped, except I had Archangel of Wrath, and then the next turn I had another Archangel of Wrath, and everything was fine. I used this to kill all kinds of creatures with the kicker ability, but also knock off multiple planeswalkers. As some of you may have seen, there was a turn where I played this and killed 2 planeswalkers with the kicker ability and stabilized my life total, and went on to win a game where that game was just looked 100% over. But this card's ability to stabilize is incredible, because not only do you get to knock out some of their creatures, now they have to get through the 3/4, and if they don't have removal for it on the spot, it can, like, that life-linking body can stabilize all on its own. Archangel of Wrath is a much better card than I thought it was. And in the domain decks, which are often very base white, whether it's Xur, like in Xur, I'm playing basically Esper in that Xur enchantments deck with the domain Tri-lands splashed in to make Leyline better. But I can also use those domain Tri-lands to kick Archangel of Wrath, which is a really good bonus. So yeah, I recommend 2 of these. I think it's that good. And the last card I have in my overperformers is Sarah Paragon. This card, at times, especially in like the mid game, a game that was grinding out, that was starting to draw its way into the late game, was the best thing I could draw. Once the removal is spent, once the battle is held, once you're in that top deck war that Liliana can create, or once you're just in that attrition war that playing all of these, you know, powerful cards can create, when you slam a Sarah Paragon and do things like get back your Xur and reanimate stuff, recast your Liliana of the Veil, like I mean, it's a very good card, and I don't know how many you need. I'm very happy with the 2 I had in my Xur deck. Sometimes you just play it, get back a Spirited Companion, and then when your Spirited Companion dies, you gain 2 life. That's a great kind of mid-game play to reload and get things cooking. But like just getting back a cycled Triome that you cycled earlier or discarded to some other effect like your Celestis, just hitting another land drop can be really nice. In that mid to late game, every Triome that you draw, and we're often running 12 of them to make our Leyline good, every Triome that you draw, you can cycle it and then play it. Like that alone, some of you know what I'm talking about. That value gives you the little goosebumps. So yeah, Sarah Paragon overperformed what I thought would be just a mediocre card. There were definitely spots where I was drawing it and I'm like, oh, that's the best draw I could get. So yeah, Sarah Paragon, thumbs up, probably a 2 of. So enough with all the lovey-dovey, I'm so glad this card is good stuff. Let's talk about the traps. Let's talk about the cards that underperformed. Let's save your wild cards, right? So here we go. The unders, as we're going to put it. Actually, just a second. Okay, here to talk about the underperforming cards from Dominaria United early access event, at least in my opinion, formed by me playing with the cards and by me watching other people play the cards. Number 1 here is going to be the Evolved Sleeper. Evolved Sleeper looked like a pretty trap-like mana sink. I didn't see it I don't know if I ever saw level 3 get used, even when the option was there to get used, and the card often was just struggling to deal damage and get around on the board and dying to the various sweeper effects that show up from Temporary Lockdown and Meathook Massacre. In fact, you're going to notice a trend. A lot of the cards I'm going to talk about are cheap cards. That's because cheap cards got massacred left and right everywhere I looked, just absolutely slaughtered by that dreaded legendary enchantment, the Meathook Massacre. And now with Temporary Lockdown also in the mix, it seems like you just can't do anything for 2 mana that is very effective. So that's going to be one of the great challenges of the format, is what 2-drops actually do work. The next card I have here is Shivan Devastator. This card is not bad. It didn't truly fail, and it definitely won some games during the event. I put it here because of Temporary Lockdown and how good Leyline is. Leyline of Binding on this card means if they do remove the Leyline, they get back a 0/0, which is a total fail for something you can sink that much mana into. And do not forget for a moment, Leyline of Binding is an instant. It has flash. So it just comes down, nukes your whole turn because you probably sunk all your mana into the Devastator. And then, yeah, it's bad. So for me, I wouldn't craft Shivan Devastator. It might be an important part of some decks. I saw it do good work in things like Gruul Modify. It was a cool one of in several Rakdos lists. But just because I think Leyline is that good, I wouldn't craft it. I'm too scared to craft it. The next card is Guardian of New Banalia, a card I wasn't very high on that I thought might take up the spot in Boros, try to replace Luminarch Aspirate because it does have some cool abilities. But as feared, it got massacred a lot, it got locked down a lot, and it didn't deal a lot of damage. Indestructible in general as an ability is kind of bad when there's so much exile and -X in the format. The next card is Stronghold Arena, and I'm going to go on record. I don't think I built my deck that played this card very well, but I couldn't find anybody else really getting a lot of traction out of the card either. My next step, like the problem was usually you would get it down but only have one creature out to activate it. If the opponent removed that creature, then now you're behind from having not played enough creatures. So playing it on turn 2 wasn't usually the way. You usually had to develop a board that was sticky enough that the opponent couldn't remove it easily and then play the arena. Kind of asking a lot, and I don't think I found the right shell for it. I think I need to kind of rebuild around what the arena should be, and maybe it's something like a tempo deck that runs really evasive cheap flyers like 1,000 Faces, Ninja of 1,000 Faces, whatever that thing is, Shadow of 1,000 Face Shadow, some kind of ninja thing. Maybe that's where Stronghold Arena belongs, but even just saying that, it sounds very weak to a number of the cards that are already in the format. So I've gone from pretty high on the arena to very skeptical, and I would hold off on it until we build a better deck. And I haven't seen that deck. I haven't found it, and I didn't see anybody else who did. The Raven Man. Yep, cheap, dies to everything. I had many opponents make 1/1 birds against me, and I made some 1/1 birds. I don't think they ever mattered. Once again, all the little stuff just seems to get absolutely crushed or overpowered in this format. If you made 2 birds and your opponent curved into Joda and attacked you for 50, who cares about birds that can't block? Even if these could block, I'm not sure that this card would be particularly bonkers. So while the Raven Man looks good, especially with Liliana, who I still believe is good, I wouldn't craft it because I just don't think it's enough board impact. It all dies, man. And on that note, Rodda's Firebrand gets a lot of the same review. I did die to this card, though. It was definitely at its best in an aggro deck that just ran the Streets of New Capenna tri-lands. I'm just going to keep saying triomes, even though I know they're not. The family lands. Even though it didn't really need those colors, it just ran them to activate Domain and played like Domain aggro, so it could actually activate this, in which case it makes just about everything unable to block and hits for a lot. So I did die to this card here and there, but it suffers from the same problems as all the other cheap creatures. Elana Warloam Speaker definitely suffers. I never saw it make a 3/3 elemental, and while it did some good color fixing, it also just died to a lot of the same things that the others did. Weatherlike Completed. You would think with all these cheap cards dying that Weatherlike Completed could shine, but I never saw this turn into a creature. I never saw a card get drawn from it. I just saw some scrying. It seemed like a pretty easy card to navigate, and you can also just imagine the pain of finally getting the counters on it, only to have Leyline Binding hit it. And this isn't a card I would recommend crafting at this time. Continuing down the list of underperformers, we have the Voldalion Mindslinger. Some of these, I'm just going to say the time that they were played against me and what happened. They played this. I killed it. I got my thing back. They died. Obviously, that's a fail state for the card that exists, but it is like, it's a lot of mana to get blown out, because usually you're not going to play this for 3 and gain and take control of anything meaningful. Next up is Hottie Jin. Each time my opponents played this, I was pretty happy about it. I saw a lot of 1/4 and 2/4 Hottie Jins hit the battlefield, and then I had the turn cycle to deal with it or play something more concerning, and it didn't bother me. So I'm not afraid of this card after early access. Nobody was ever able to really use it against me in a way that scared me. Karn Living Legacy. My opponent played it once, I killed them. I didn't see anybody play this to tremendous effect in Standard. A Johnny Sleeper Agent. My opponent played it once, and it was even on the battlefield for 2 or 3 turns using the +1, and I still didn't have any problem dealing with it or the opponent. I still think that this card is like, looking at the card more, it's definitely a super powerful bury you card when you're ahead, like you drop this on turn 4 with a board and you're in amazing position, but it does not play particularly well from behind. It is just throw it out there and plus, and something bad happens if you don't have a board. And in that same vein, kind of Jaya sort of had the same thing going on, and like I was well able to smash those cards. When you think about comparing these to a deck that plays Joda and just get some legendary humans on the battlefield instead of these and just crushes, like this starts to look more and more underpowered, so I wouldn't craft this yet. Urtie Resurrected. This card I was very medium on, not sure where it would fall. This card for me is an underperformer after the day. Here's the thing with Urtie. I think a lot of people are going to get this card wrong. This is a tempo card, and it's only a tempo card. In the 5-color human legendary deck, you need to be playing this on turn 4, counter or destroy their best thing, then untap, play Joda, swing, win. That is the play pattern where this card is amazing. If you play this in any kind of mid-range or control deck, you are going to be falling behind, because you give your opponent a card, you put in 4 mana, and you made a very mediocre body, not a body that's going to swing many games. It felt really bad to be countering abilities or spells or destroying creatures, having the opponents draw cards. If you didn't win the game, like in the next 2 turns, you usually got outvalued, because there's so much value in this format. And letting the opponent draw cards probably just draws them closer to absolute bombs like Zur and Joda. So I'm lower on Urtie. I'm probably still going to play it, but it is strictly an aggro card that creates tempo. It is not a mid-range card or a control card, in my opinion. And I implore you not to fall into that trap. Drag to the Bottom is an underperformer for me, and it's not because it doesn't sweep the board when it needs to. It definitely does a good job. Here's the thing. You don't need it. Meat Hook and Temporary Lockdown really do the job, and then after that, I thought that what you needed Drag to the Bottom for was to bridge that gap between the time where your opponent plays something with decent stats and the time when your Meat Hook could kill it. Leyline Binding does that. You just use the ley lines to take out those things you can't hook, and you hook or lock down the rest. So I still might play 1 or 2 of these in my domain control decks, but you do not need this card. It is kind of just extra, and I think 1 might be the right number at the end of the day. Next on the cards that underperformed in the event for me is Defiler of Flesh. Defiler of Flesh, I'm going to throw in all of the Defilers. Standard is too small of a format for these. it's like if you play this and untap with it and play a bunch of things, you're probably going to win. But if you play any of the good 4-drops in standard and untap with them, you're probably going to win. So it's better to play one that creates immediate board impact and value. And there were too many times where you cast Defiler of Flesh, look across the board at your opponent, and they don't have to change their game plan at all. They can just fly over it, they can go bigger than it, they can ignore it, and you just, like, it actually doesn't make a difference. And then even when you untap the next turn, you're like, well, I can gain Menace, I guess, and get a little bit of cost reduction. Like, it's another card that played incredibly well if you were ahead, just curve stomping on an opponent who wasn't prepared for your strategy or had a bad draw. But every time you were parity or behind, you're like, I should have a card in this spot that does something different. And I found Sheldred to actually be a lot better than Defiler of Flesh in all those spots because it did impact the way that the game played. The opponents had a really hard time racing you and they had a hard time killing it, whereas this, as a 4/4, often got killed by like the voltage surges of the world, and it was not good, man. It was not good. So I think that the black one is the closest one to playable of all of them, but I still would not craft any Defilers. I really wouldn't. I think that those cards are really good in Commander. They might be okay in Historic Brawl, but probably not. And I think that that's where they're meant to live. The next card that I'm now lower on is Thram Portal. I think I underrated something about this card, and that is the fact that you need to play it as one of your first 3 lands to have it untapped. You would often look at your hand and be like, okay, I want to play a Thram Portal here because I don't want it to be a tapped land later. I need to curve out. But the earlier you play the portal, you take damage whenever you tap it at all. So while you feel like you should play it on turn 2, because you're nervous that you'll top deck another one and you don't want it to be a tapped land on turn 4, the earlier you play it, the more damage you take. So that's kind of rough. On the other hand, I'm not saying that this card is bad. You probably still want to craft it for the aggro decks that don't have the pain lands yet. And you might still need it for decks that run Leyline of Binding, because it does count as a land type, because you named the land type. So I'm not completely off Thram Portal, and I'm probably still going to craft 4. And there are going to be a lot of decks that need it. It's important that it exists, but it's not as great as I thought it was. And it is something where finding the right number of Thram Portals, is this a 3 Thram Portal deck? Is this a 2 Thram Portal deck? Maybe there's the cheeky 1 of Thram Portal deck, Finding the right number of Thram Portals is going to be tricky and more of a balancing act than just auto-including 4, which I thought was it's definitely where I started. I still think it's a 4 of in the humans decks though. So we'll see. But I'm not as high on it as I was. It's still an important part of the format. And on the same note are the pain lands. I'm not as high on them as I used to be. And it's mostly because the mana is so good for the legendary deck and the 5-color deck and the tribal deck. Secluded Courtyard, the Plaza of Legends. Gosh, it's the land that has 4 abilities. You know the one, the legendary land. And Thram Portal, I think, make it so that not every deck wants or needs the pain lands in the way that I expected, and not every deck needs to play 4 of them. I do think there will still be, if you're going to play any of the 2-color decks, that this matches the pair, that this is a rock solid 4 of in those decks. But when you play a bunch of Thram Portals and a bunch of pain lands, let's just say even with a lot of lifelink in your deck, sometimes things get dicey. So the pain lands in the 3, 4, and 5-color decks are much closer to 1-ofs than they are to 4-ofs. All right, is that my list? Did we do it? So that's a review of all the unders and overs from early access. The decks that I'm highest on are honestly a lot of mid-range Fable of the Mirrorbreaker Titan stuff. Like, that looks really, really good. The 5-color human deck looks really, really good. That looks like the aggro deck of choice. And the Zur deck, I think, is very legit. I look forward to trying out more different shells, both for humans, Joda, and Zur. I think that there's still a lot to be done there with cards like Rafine. So I think that Esper type shells around Zur and Joda are going to be a big part of the brewing and things that we're going to try to master for this format. I think there is probably a good mono black mid-range-ish deck that I haven't quite found the right cards for. As far as aggro goes, I don't know if there's a good monocolored aggro deck anymore. They all looked really bad. Both me playing against them, me playing the mono black one I tried, and watching other people play monocolored aggro, it looked really bad. And compared to the power of the level of the 5-color decks, rip wild cards. It's going to be an interesting experiment to try to find the cheap aggro deck that becomes the like toilet gamer's weapon of choice, so it defines meta. Because I think the only thing holding back Joe to humans is going to be the cost. Yeah, really. So, you know, start your conspiracy theories. Is this what Wizards wanted? Did they do this on purpose? Are they just trying to get those toilet gamers to spend the most money? I mean, it might work, but it's a weird change of pace. I can't remember this happening. It's been a lot of years. I think like Apocalypse might be the last time I remember something like this, where going into a smaller standard, usually when you rotate, when 4 sets leave and 1 set enters, monocolored aggro decks are at their best, the best they are in the whole format, because there's usually one deck. It's been mono white for a while. It was mono red before, that just has the best possible curve, and you just spam it forever, and the card quality overall is low, so the other decks don't quite have what it takes, you know, to deal with it. And this time it looks like we're going to actually have 5 colors as the pushed archetype, and the monocolor decks have a card quality problem. So what will that bring for the format? What will standard be? I definitely believe that the starting place as we try to solve it is going to be various Zur piles, various like Liliana piles. There must be one in there that's good. Anvil is a deck that scares me, but its play pattern, I don't know if it will take off. The 5-color humans aggro deck is going to be a killer. And then we have the 5-color kind of control deck, which is also kind of a mid-range deck, just very, very powerful cards. And I look forward to working on all those decks and getting videos out with them soon, as well as playing and tuning them when I live stream on YouTube on release day. So at the time you're watching this, I'll probably be live around 2 or 3 Eastern, and we'll go as long as we're having fun and try to see what we can do on ladder as we attempt to solve a brand new format. Exciting stuff, totally awesome, really excited about the set. I had a really great time, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave me a comment, let me know if it helped you, and if you enjoyed this video. And if you want a gameplay, just come back in a few hours for live gameplay. And don't worry, live content will not take over the channel completely if it's not your cup of tea. I expect to make live gameplay to still have like traditional YouTube recorded videos on the daily, and then do live streams when it feels right. So again, thank you for all the support. It's awesome to feel welcome live streaming on YouTube. It's very cool to have so many people show up. And that brings us to the end of this video, where I'm just rambling now. So I guess I should just look at the camera and frickin' say it. You're cool.